Welcome back to Corporate Governance in Action. In this program, we will be looking at corporate governance in mainland China. China embarked on her market reforms 30 years ago and has transformed herself at impressive speed into a major player in the global economy. Its GDP grew by 9.7% a year on average from 1990 to 2005, and the pace of growth shows little sign of abating. Therefore, corporate governance reform has to keep pace with a rapidly expanding business environment. Over the last 5 years, mainland China has brought in a new companies law, a code of best practice, and new securities rules. It has adopted quarterly reporting, and they are now moved to bring in international accounting standards. Despite this surge in corporate governance regulation, many core corporate governance concepts are still very new to mainland China. Issues such as the need for independent directors or the defense of minority shareholders' rights are not high on the agenda. Moreover, defense of minority shareholders' rights is made particularly difficult due to deficiency in China's legal system. Other corporate governance concepts, such as the need for the separation of the roles of CEOs and chairmen of the board, are also largely alien to China's business culture. To get an accurate picture of where mainland China stands in terms of her corporate governance standards, we need to look at the way companies are run in practice. We asked our guests what are the levels of compliance with the new corporate governance rules of the last 5 years, how effective is the enforcement of these new rules, and what are the main challenges to corporate governance reform.
Corporate governance in the mainland has its own unique challenges because China is in the process of economic reform, moving from a centrally planned communist economy to a market economy. In my view, they are not as far along that slope of reform as some observers and investors would have you believe. And that means that in terms of the governance of the listed companies that China has created in the last decade, there are issues relating to other objectives of the government as the major shareholder, for example, whether to take over a loss-making company to maintain the employment in that company, whether to direct that industries be consolidated because the government decides that that is the right thing rather than allowing the free market to decide. There are issues surrounding the underdeveloped property title system, the certainty that a company actually owns the property that it thinks it owns, and the grey areas of the law in an underdeveloped legal system. The system for settling commercial disputes in China is still underdeveloped. Often the judges in a particular municipality would be subject to just fairly strong influence from the politicians in a municipality. And I think within my lifetime, China will be a democratic country. And with that goes the prospect of evolution of its current control system. With a democratic government, you're likely to see a continuation of the privatization process that China has begun, because at the moment it still has a very much control mentality. It wishes to maintain controlling stakes in all its key industries, telecoms, oil, roads, whatever power. They want to have their hands on the levers of the economy. But with democracy tends to come more relaxation of that. And I often draw a parallel with the UK as it stood in the 1970s and China as it stood about 10 years ago. If you look at the UK in the 70s, it was a socialist economy. The government owned the electricity companies, the water companies, the oil companies, the gas companies, car makers. It owned Rolls-Royce, it owned British Airways. It owned so many areas of the economy outright. Over time, it first floated those companies, then released its control altogether by cancelling what they called the golden share, which gave it a veto right on takeovers. sold down its stake from 100% to 75%, eventually to 0. There is on the optimistic side of what could happen in China, the prospect that the giant mainland enterprises that we see today, that are still state-controlled but listed, would evolve into these widely held listed companies without major shareholders, with the governance mechanisms that we see in the UK, for example, where institutional investors call the shots on behalf of beneficiaries. Retail investors also have a say, and there is a vibrant free market. So that's the upside to Chinese reform, but I think it's unlikely to happen until political reform takes place.
Well, we do an annual survey with CLSA where we do a country ranking, and China usually scores fairly close to the bottom. The reason for that is, in terms of rules and regulations, they brought in a lot of changes in the last 5 years. They brought in a company law, they've amended their securities rules, they brought in a code of best practice on corporate governance, they've brought in lots of securities directives and so on. So I'd say in terms of rules and regulations, they've already got a lot that is there that they can use. Also in terms of accounting standards, although they are well behind international accounting standards, there has been at least some movement in that area to bring more international accounting standards into China. Where China does fall down, though, is on one hand the enforcement by the regulator. There are a lot of problems with the regulator being able to enforce corporate governance rules in China. Some of those relate to sort of the standing of the regulator within the overall government system. Some relate to the lack of cooperation it gets from the provinces. Some relate to just the lack of cooperation it gets from some of the listed companies. So the regulator certainly finds quite a lot of difficulties enforcing the rules in China. There's another area of problem is the fact that the regulator is an arm of government, and many of the listed companies are state enterprises owned by government. So it's difficult for one arm of government to enforce rules basically against other entities that are government owned and controlled. And another area is really the corporate governance culture in China, in these companies. I mean, to say it's early days is probably a bit of an understatement. In some companies, particularly the ones listed overseas and operating internationally, some of those companies, the Sinopec, for example, the PetroChinas, I mean, some of those have been implementing corporate governance best practices, either because they've been forced to by Beijing or because they're listing overseas. And they're certainly cognizant of the importance of corporate governance, but you've still got a lot of other companies in China, listed companies and clearly a lot of unlisted companies for whom corporate governance is a very, very nascent concept. And the idea of the independent director doesn't make a great deal of sense, and the concept of shareholder rights doesn't make a great deal of sense. So, I would say China is still very much at the beginning in terms of the corporate implementation of good governance. But again, I don't see any reason why Chinese companies couldn't over time be good at corporate governance. I mean, we need to. It depends again on which market they're operating in, whether they operate overseas or just locally, and also depends on the ownership structure. I think as the ownership structure changes in China from state to a mix of state and private, or now you have a lot of private firms, that could lay the groundwork for better governance.